Good evening, welcome. My name is Alden Reed, and you're watching Arcane Tablets. So tonight, I just want to talk a bit about politics and conspiracy. And the main message that I have is that it is not meaningful to talk about politics. It is not meaningful to analyze political science anymore without directly talking about conspiratorial behavior, without talking about elite, occult, oligarchical activity, without talking about the way in which they manipulate and influence and wield power. Most politicians at a higher level, right, they're just actors at this point. They're creatures serving the interest of these ostensibly private, occult, oligarchical forces, right? And there's always been this kind of manipulation. There's nothing new about that. What's new is the scale of it, the intensity. And that's because of modern technology, especially. And I'll talk a little bit more specifically about that separately later. But basically, it's just really easy for modern elites to network together, okay? Modern technology has enabled rapid communication and made it easy for people to travel around and coordinate things together. And so, whereas in the past, most of these elites and oligarchical forces in their own countries, to a certain extent, had to work within the context of the politics of their local societies, right? They needed all these people to continue helping them, right? And it was very hard to coordinate with other elites from other societies and countries. Even though, of course, I think from the earliest days, they certainly recognized that they had probably a lot more in common with other elites than they did with the common people, right? The 99%, right? And that's the extent to which, again, politics has always been kind of conspiracy, right? Because we have all these people getting together, creating a society, creating all these goods and services. And the question is, who gets the stuff? Who gets the loot? Who makes the decisions? Who wields the power? And so powerful elites have always been using various methods to try and manipulate people. And traditionally, it had a lot to do with just raw brute force, right? Just violence, the monopoly of violence. And then it kind of evolved more to have to do with ideology a little bit more specifically, right? Oftentimes justifying elite control and violent behavior by advancing certain ideological packages, especially religious ideas, but even more recently, in the past couple hundred years, more secular ideas. Obviously, World War II was not really about religion, but that didn't mean that there wasn't a whole lot of ideological intensity, right? No, you do not need religion and God to be good at killing other human beings, okay? You can find a lot of different ways to justify that. You can find a lot of different ways to justify wielding power, to justify taking the lion's share of the wealth in society, okay? But yeah, it doesn't make sense to talk about politics outside of the context of these things anymore. It does not make sense to talk about what Donald Trump does outside of the reality that he is just an actor, a political creature in service of an increasingly aligned, centralized, corporate, oligarchical, global, occult order. I'm sure there's some other adjectives and descriptors I could throw in there, right? You think that he makes decisions because that's what he thinks he should do? You think that Joe Biden did? Or Obama? Or Bush? Or Clinton? Or Reagan? Even Jimmy Carter? I don't know. Nixon? LBJ? Oh, I think the last president that tried to make some real decisions without getting them approved, well, we know what happened to him. which certainly sent a chilling message to everyone else that it was going to be time to get on board. But at the same time, then they created, in the wake of the public execution of John Fitzgerald Kennedy, the conspiracy theory discourse. Basically, they just did exactly what everyone thinks they did. And then had the gall to use their power and their influence, especially among certain intellectuals in the media and other places, to completely stigmatize any attempt at discussing the reality of politics, right? Even to the point where we sort of retroactively now go back and don't acknowledge how conspiratorial politics generally has been throughout most of history. Now, obviously, the great majority of people are interacting with governments and with politicians in sort of a different way, and you can analyze that in a discrete way, and that's not totally meaningless. But if you want to understand why these things are really happening and who's really making these decisions and who's sort of steering the ship, you have to talk about these other things. You're carrying water for them by ignoring it. That's what they want you to do, of course, more than anything. It's why they can so brazenly just kind of tell you who they are all the time. They don't really try to hide it, do they? They don't need to. Not when all of these public intellectuals, who are, again, supposed to be the gatekeepers, supposed to be the people protecting us, supposed to be the people muckraking and getting the scoop, not when they're not doing their job. And so we have to do a better job of that. And that does mean putting yourself on the line. That does mean risking your profession, right? Being seen as not serious. Being stigmatized by your peers. And possibly also risking your life. Right? Just because the powers that be tend to try to avoid using violence to solve problems these days, right? They much prefer media and capitalist manipulation. Doesn't mean that they won't. Again, as we all saw in 1963 and so many other times, they certainly will. The main reason that they don't just wantonly employ violence is because they have found a more effective way to manipulate and influence and control people. Because when you have a democratically elected government and civil rights and a constitution and all these things and the rule of law, people tend to feel safer. They tend to feel like they have more power. They tend to feel like they're more in control of things. And there are some ways in which all of those things have changed the world for the better. I'm not saying that we would rather live in ancien regime France, okay? There's a whole host of other problems with that. But just because the French and the American revolutions and all these things happened, which I might add, very much did happen at the behest of some of these forces as well, does not mean that these oligarchical forces have stopped trying to manipulate and influence and control things. To the contrary, they've rather accelerated it. In fact, they quite like modern systems of government. Right? You don't need to worry about the king or the nobles because you can just control both political parties. Now, I'm not saying that there isn't any shadier business that goes on at times, but to be honest, I don't even think that they need to really steal an election. Why would you need to do that? Because you control the politicians on both sides. They're both your actors. They're both creatures serving your interest. And so we do ourselves a disservice And being ignorant of this coalescing oligarchical, corporate, occult, dystopian order is not going to save us from it. If we want to find some timelines, if we want to find a path to a better reality, we're going to have to be more honest about these things. And we're going to have to stop pulling punches. And I want to talk about this more constructively too, not just rant like I have been sometimes, about how just furious it makes me. Especially just all the manipulation and the deception and the poisoning and the cowardice. Bros, at least do it the old way, right? I'm not endorsing violence, but I can respect that there was something a lot more honest about all these old school warlords, right? That's what the whole right of conquest idea is about. At least they were not lying. At least they were actually putting their lives on the line in many cases to try and come take your stuff. Now these people, they're just a bunch of cowards. They would never risk their lives or be honest about what they're doing. And so that's the game they're playing. We can't just keep focusing on old school tyranny and old school kind of military dictatorial behavior, right? Right? More traditional authoritarianism, maybe more associated with Putin or the Saudis or China or something like that. We do need to also talk more directly about what's going on in the democratic world, in the Western world. And it is simply no longer meaningful to talk about politics in any larger sense, to try and understand really what's happening behind the scenes, without talking about conspiracy and oligarchy and occult behavior and dystopia. And I do believe, again, there is a narrow path through that we can find to a better world. But we must be honest with ourselves about what we're dealing with. So thank you very much for watching this video. I want you to know that I love you very much and that God loves you very much. I want you to know that there is a way through this, even as difficult as it may be at times and depressing as it may be at times. I do believe we can find a way through. But we must start being honest with ourselves. And if all sorts of professional intellectuals and academics and journalists and other people are going to continue ignoring these things, then we need to ignore them and create a whole new network in order to talk about these things meaningfully, in order to educate people about these things. But it starts with regular people, probably like you, who are just watching this video, and being brave and not letting people shut you down and not sitting there listening to people talk about Trump as if he's like just trying to make himself a king, or the Republican Party, or these various conservative forces, right? As if they're just these traditional sort of oligarchical elites. They are not. They have evolved into something much more psychotic and sociopathic and monstrous. And it is very important to be honest about this and clear about this in order to build a better world for all of us together. Many blessings. We will see you again soon.